In 2007, Omid Tahvili, the leader of a Persian organized crime group in Canada, walked out of prison in British Columbia while still in custody. Tahvili escaped a maximum security prison by wearing a janitor's uniform and bribing a guard to look the other way. On November 15, 2007, Mr. Tahvili managed to convince almost everyone that he was a member of the cleaning staff, just ending his shift. Without any effort, he passed under the watchful glass eyes of 100 security cameras at the North Fraser Pretrial Center, where he'd been held for 27 months. Only one guard in the high-security prison in Port Coquitlam, just outside Vancouver, apparently knew that night who the man in the black cleaning outfit really was. Corrections Officer Edwin Tickney was in on the plan, willingly opening a series of locked doors to escort Mr. Tahvili outside, where he got in a car and drove off. It was the first time anyone has ever escaped from the prison, which was built in 2001 at a cost of $49 million. At 53, Mr. Tahvili is now one of Canada's most wanted fugitives. A stocky man with a distinctive smile, he could be mistaken for a reputable businessman running Platinum Touch, an auto shop in Richmond, BC. Yet his tattoos reveal a darker side, a cross, a fire spiral, and his children's faces inked on his body. Rumors suggested one tattoo was linked to a debt enforced by a triad, a detail mirroring the blend of truth and lies characterizing his post-1994 life in Canada. Convicted of kidnapping and assault in 2007, evidence revealed Tahvili's role as a Persian gang leader in BC, involved in narcotics trafficking. Despite years evading law enforcement, a misplaced Purolator package in 2005 exposed his criminal endeavors, marking the beginning of his downfall. This incident led to the unraveling of Tahvili's covert operations, previously undetected by police. Police suspected a lost Purolator shipment meant for Mr. Tahvili contained $200,000, though he initially claimed it held vital documents, later alleging it was $350,000 from a Toronto business sale. When Tahvili demanded to meet the involved Purolator employees, Senior District Manager Robert Candido refused. Tahvili hinted at union involvement, cryptically referring to Hell's Angels, Vietnamese, and Iranians. Candido eventually named a suspect, DL, who had abruptly departed to Vietnam. Subsequently, Tahvili's associates visited DL's brother-in-law, DT, intending to test drive a Mercedes listed for sale. During the test, an orchestrated stop led an Infiniti QX4 to block them, showcasing Tahvili's reach and the complex web of threats underpinning his operations. This episode highlighted the lengths to which Tahvili would go to retrieve the missing package, involving intimidation and leveraging criminal connections. Mr. Tahvili, armed, coerced DT into an SUV, warning him to reveal DL's and the missing package's whereabouts by midnight, threatening his family's safety. In an office, 3 men terrorized DT, threatening his wife and subjecting him to humiliating and painful acts, including simulating castration and running a razor down his back. They assaulted him, threatening further abuse. Tahvili then performed a deceitful act of compassion, kissing DT's hands before feigning a rescue attempt from the kidnappers. This orchestrated manipulation, as described by Judge Joyce, was likely a ploy to portray Tahvili alternately as a tormentor and a savior, embodying a manipulative bad guy good guy tactic. This incident underscored the extreme lengths Tahvili would go to assert control and instill fear, utilizing physical and psychological torment to retrieve information. After being released, DT was warned by his captors against police contact. Yet upon returning home and finding his wife with an RCMP officer, he was convinced to disclose the ordeal. This led to an undercover operation, including phone taps on Mr. Tahvili, culminating in his arrest at an airport. Facing kidnapping and assault charges, Tahvili escaped custody before sentencing. Accomplice Mr. Tickney was arrested for aiding the escape. Tahvili remains at large, with potential hideouts spanning Canada to Europe. In 1997, Moriah's shock incarceration facility inmate Victor Figueroa disappeared from the New York security compound without a trace. To this day, authorities have no official ruling as to what happened or where he went. It was during a routine phone call with his sister, Yvette Cruz, a few days before his alleged flight, that he had voiced unrest with his conditions, complaining of abuse from a particular guard and an overall feeling of angst. Then on February 6th, the 21-year-old Figueroa was declared missing and a massive manhunt was organized in pursuit of him. "There is a guard who keeps messing with me. Look, I have to let you go," Figueroa shared with his sister before disappearing entirely a few days later. She replied, "You know I love you. This is going to end in a few months. Please call me tomorrow." Following the realization of the inmate's absence, searchers examined the surrounding area and found footprints leading to a nearby abandoned mine shaft. They surmised that Figueroa had fled to the mine to avoid detection and had fallen to his death. Further pursuit was halted. Conditions in the mine were too dangerous for a thorough search to be performed. After officials failed to provide sufficient answers, Figueroa's family became restless in their drive to find out what happened to their loved one. However, authorities threatened to arrest the fugitive's sister if she took to the mines herself or tried to hire a private search party. "I was going crazy. He was my other half," she shared years later. She said she would try calling the jail and they would hang up on me. "No one would tell me anything." The family suspected foul play on the part of the law and prison officials, but nothing was ever confirmed. Some 25 years later, Victor Figueroa's disappearance remains a puzzling mystery. He is the only New York prisoner today to escape and not be found. What do you think? Do you think Victor managed to escape successfully, or did something else happen here? Raymond Abbott, an athletic former U.S. Army infantry soldier, liked to introduce himself as RoboCop, after the science fiction law enforcer who literally gets shot to pieces but remains unstoppable. Abbott put that name to the test when he tried a daring escape from a maximum security prison in Puerto Rico. It was a performance every bit as daredevil as any Hollywood superstars. In February 1992, the 31-year-old Abbott was arrested for smuggling weapons after an investigation by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. Abbott pleaded guilty and was sent to a maximum security penitentiary in Rio Piedras, Puerto Rico, where he awaited sentencing. But investigators say Abbott had no intention of staying in jail for long. They say he patiently planned an escape and worked long and hard to get physically fit, sometimes doing as many as 1,000 push-ups a day in his cell. He was in excellent physical condition, said Roberto Vizcarrando, senior criminal investigator at the U.S. Marshals. When the time came for his escape, Abbott dashed past a guard who had entered his cell for prisoner count and bolted out the door. By the time he made it to the prison's interior patio, the guards were hot on his trail. In a scene straight out of an action movie, bullets whizzed by as Abbott, who had swaddled himself in a blanket and mattress foam for protection, sprinted across the patio and jumped down on the barbed wire enclosure outside. The guards kept shooting at him, but Abbott escaped. His daredevil flight landed Abbott on the U.S. Marshals' most wanted list. He is now being hunted by officials for escaping the maximum security prison, smuggling guns, and threatening a federal officer while in prison. Those threats were directed against ATF agent Reynaldo Rodriguez, the man who arrested Abbott for smuggling weapons from Miami to gangs and drug cartels in Puerto Rico. The arrest didn't sit well with Abbott, who felt that, as leader of a powerful gang, he had been humiliated. So he vowed while he was in prison to get Rodriguez killed. He wanted to show that he had people on the streets to take care of him, Vizcarrando explained. But now that he was out of jail, Abbott decided to take matters into his own hands. A few days after his escape, Abbott's grandmother claimed he had called her and vowed that he would kill Rodriguez before he ever returned to jail. Abbott wasn't always a hardened criminal. Born in Miami on April 7, 1961, he was considered a good student as a child. But while he was still young, his mother divorced his father and went to Puerto Rico. It is thought that at this time, Abbott came into contact with gangs and stepped into the world of crime. Marshals say that he is articulate, likes to work out, and has an affinity for motorcycles and guns. He is extremely knowledgeable in weapons, well-versed in the use of high-powered firearms, and interested in motorbikes, said Vizcarrando. Abbott has other interests too. He was always surrounded with nice-looking females, said Vizcarrando. In fact, it was his passion for women that gave rise to rumors that he had died from AIDS. But the rumors have been dispelled. According to investigators, Abbott is thought to be alive and well, running an underworld weapons and prostitution smuggling ring. Vizcarrando said Abbott is believed to be living somewhere in the states bordering Mexico, where he does business with his extensive network of contacts in the illegal firearms markets south of the border. Abbott has been on the lam for 16 years. He is considered extremely violent and dangerous, and there is a $25,000 reward for any information that can lead to his arrest. He can sometimes be friendly, said Vizcarrando, but he cautioned he is always looking for trouble. A convicted murderer who escaped from a South Texas prison nearly 14 years ago has been added to the U.S. Marshals' 15 most wanted fugitives lists. Authorities are still searching for Jose Bustos-Diaz, 32, and are offering a reward of up to $25,000 for information directly leading to his capture. The U.S. Marshal's Office said the man is still a significant threat after escaping the TDCJ Briscoe unit in Dilley on April 6, 2010. Dilley is about 70 miles southwest of San Antonio. He was sentenced to 35 years in prison after he pleaded guilty in 2005 to murdering a woman whose body was found beaten and stabbed multiple times. Bustos-Diaz escaped with fellow inmate Octavio Ramos Lopez after they cut a hole in the fence. The manhunt led authorities to a home in Reynosa, Mexico. Ramos Lopez was captured and returned to the U.S., but Bustos-Diaz evaded arrest and has remained on the run since. U.S. Marshals Service Director Donald Washington said in a news release that the agency added Bustos-Diaz to the list because locating and apprehending this violent escapee is a top priority, and we will use every available resource to bring him to justice. After growing up inside the gangs of South Tucson, Arizona, Ruben Rodriguez was finally escaping that life and setting a new course. Rodriguez, 19, had found a good sales job at a jewelry store. He had to wear suits and a tie, and he was able to get people to buy, his mother Sandra Medina told CNN's The Hunt with John Walsh. He was really good at that. He was talking about going back to school. He was a people person, said his girlfriend, Yvette Jimenez. During high school in his single-parent household, Rodriguez joined a gang to fit in and gain protection. Getting caught with a small amount of drugs landed him in juvenile detention. He got out of detention when he turned 18. That's when he started changing, Medina said. Ruben didn't want to be involved with these people anymore. Meanwhile, a world away from Tucson's south side in the eastern part of town, Anthony Burroughs enjoyed a comfortable upbringing in a middle-class family with two parents. Burroughs was a wannabe, according to observers. The Filipino-American passed himself off as being Hispanic, said Jen Rippey, a deputy U.S. Marshal who's been investigating the case for years. Burroughs was enamored with the gangster life, Rippey said. He had a police record for theft and assaulting his girlfriend. From what I understand, he never treated her right. He had a temper and would hit her, she said. Anthony was also well known to always have a gun of some sort. When these two men's paths crossed at a house party on April 29, 2000, both their lives would drastically change forever. Outside the house, there was an altercation between Ruben and Anthony as Ruben was leaving, said Rippey. I was told that it was over a girl, said Melinda Ochoa, Ruben's ex-girlfriend. I was told that Ruben helped him up, gave him his hand and helped him up after the fight. And when Ruben was walking away, then he had shot him. Then Burroughs took off into the desert, Rippey said, while Rodriguez staggered into the house and collapsed in the kitchen. People gathered around Rodriguez to help him, but it was no use, said Tucson Police Detective Tom Stewart. He was hit in the left shoulder. The carotid artery was gone. You can't live without one of those. When Rodriguez's mother got to the hospital, she was taken to a room where she was forced to undergo an agonizing wait to learn what had happened to her son. Finally, a detective and a doctor walked in, and they told me that my son was dead, and I didn't believe them, she said. I told them they were lying to me, that I needed to see Ruben, and they wouldn't let me see him. They wouldn't let me see my son. Prosecutors charged Burroughs, 21, with murder, but just as police were preparing to arrest him, Burroughs was able to board a plane in Phoenix and escape to the Philippines. Even though Burroughs was gone, police continued to work the case. There were a lot of people giving misinformation, Stewart said. At a certain point over the years, you run out of people to talk to. The investigation stalled, Rippey said. It wasn't until 13 years later that Rippey found the break she needed to reignite the case. According to a confidential source in the Philippines, Burroughs' mother in Tucson was sending him money there. Rippey obtained a warrant in 2014 to search Burroughs' mother's home. After 14 hours of pouring through her things, police found nothing until they got to the last few boxes. We discovered these letters that Tony wrote his mother from the Philippines, Rippey said. The general theme in all of them is, poor me. Anthony was very much alive and well and living in the Philippines. As a result, deputy U.S. Marshals have been sent to Manila to work with Philippines authorities to track Burroughs. Burroughs was last reported seen in Manila in May of 2014. We very much believe that Anthony's mother has tipped him off and drove him back underground, Rippey said. We also believe she is still financing him in some way, shape, or form. This is what I do. I chase fugitives. It doesn't matter. You can run as far as you want, for as long as you want, but eventually, we'll be there. Larry Chism is a criminal, convicted felon from Arkansas, and a fugitive for many years. In 1978, he escaped from a Lonoke County jail and was never apprehended. He was placed on the wanted list of the U.S. Marshals and the FBI, and in 1990, he was featured on the television show Unsolved Mysteries, generating national notoriety that led him to flee again. He is considered armed and dangerous, but his whereabouts have remained unknown since 1990. Larry Porter Chism was born on December 19, 1948, in Forest City, St. Francis County, the son of Millard Harry Chism Jr. and Frances Louise Porter Chism. Both were natives of Arkansas. Chism's maternal grandfather was John Rosamond Jack Porter, mayor of Forest City for 10 years. Chism graduated from Forest City High School. His yearbook lists him as a member of the Glee Club, choir, Latin club, and motorcycle club, and mentions that he did running laps. Chism wore thick glasses and was reportedly a studious and intelligent student. After high school, Chism enrolled in Memphis State University, now the University of Memphis, and eventually had plans to become a lawyer. In August 1968, he married Elizabeth Wirtz, born in Forest City. They lived in West Memphis, Crittenden County, at the time while Chism attended school. In 1970, Chism was drafted into the U.S. Army and served in Vietnam in a combat role. For his merits, he received 2 medals. In 1972, he returned to the United States and resumed his studies at Memphis State. Chism apparently began committing serious crimes after he returned from Vietnam. His criminal record would eventually include drug trafficking, armed robbery, and kidnapping. Ironically, he was weeks away from completing his law degree when he was first arrested in 1974 for running a drug smuggling business. Authorities discovered that Chism employed other students to transport drugs to Mexico. He was eventually arrested for armed robbery and distributing heroin. In July 1974, he was sentenced in Tennessee to 40 years in prison. For a time, Chism was a model prisoner. He had a good rapport with inmates and guards and often acted as a mediator between the two. He even wrote for the prison newspaper. But in the late summer of 1978, Chism made his first successful escape from prison. On September 13th, he and other prisoners were allowed to leave the prison under supervision at a bowling alley in Dixon, Tennessee, about 60 miles west of Nashville. At one point, Chism and other inmates went to the bathroom. An outside friend had left a package of weapons for Chism in the bowling alley. When a suspicious prison guard followed the inmates to the bathroom to check on them, Chism pointed a shotgun at him. A gunfight ensued. Chism wounded a guard, although he did not kill him, and Chism himself was shot in the hand. To facilitate their escape, Chism and 3 other prisoners held a bowling alley employee hostage until they were outside, then stole a car and drove the hostage to a nearby municipal airport. Their hostage was released, but Chism and his gang hijacked a plane and its pilot and ordered the man to fly them to Arkansas. Because it was not prepared for the flight, the plane experienced problems in the air. As a result, the pilot had to make an emergency landing in Marianna, Lee County, on a dirt road. A local man drove to the plane to help the passengers, but his truck was stolen by Chism. Chism's gang soon broke up, and Chism and another inmate traveled to Kentucky. The other 2 were captured by authorities not long after the plane landed in Arkansas. Apparently, Chism was stopped on his way to Texas near Calico Rock, Izard County, just a few days after he escaped from the bowling alley. Once again, Chism had stolen a truck and taken the owner hostage. Police pursued Chism, who crashed the truck after a firefight in which he was wounded. Chism was booked and jailed in Lonoke County. In September 1978, he was indicted on additional charges stemming from his escape and confessed to being guilty of the charges. He was sentenced in November, and the judge added another 30 years to the 29-year-old's already lengthy sentence. The Lonoke County Jail where he was being held was poorly secured. With the help of 3 inmates, 2 of whom had assisted him during his first escape from the bowling alley, he used a key to break through an air conditioning vent to enter a room where weapons were being held. Now armed, Chism stole the vehicle from a guard and escaped. The 3 men who helped Chism escape from jail were apprehended, but Chism was never recaptured. Chism's trail went cold after a few months. It was reported that he had robbed a bank in Cincinnati, Ohio, where he made off with $250,000 in cash without using a weapon or harming anyone. He ended up in New Orleans, Louisiana, where he lived with several women and did manual labor. In late 1979, he suffered a severe fall at a construction site and was hospitalized for weeks. After his hospital stay, Chism moved to Mobile, Alabama. There he was involved with a woman named Linda Hicks. Hicks fled the state with Chism, but because she missed her children, she soon returned home. She eventually spoke with authorities, but her information did not help them catch Chism. The last time she saw him was in Mississippi. On the run, Chism donated blood to earn extra money, and he reportedly gathered information to make false identifications by calling the parents of deceased children. It took 10 years before authorities found Chism again. This time, he was in Charlotte, North Carolina. By then, he was living under the name Kenneth Lamar Brookins. He was married to a woman named Deborah, who had also taken the surname Brookins. Chism and his wife lived a modest life in Charlotte. They were active campers and involved in their church. They were well known to their pastor, although details of their family life were vague, and they did not let people know exactly where they lived. Possibly the family consisted of children at the time. On January 3, 1990, Chism was featured in an episode of the popular television series Unsolved Mysteries. Chism saw the broadcast live himself. Fearing recapture, he left town with his family in a van, not claiming a final paycheck at work. In December of that year, Chism was spotted in Atlanta, Georgia, selling his van to a coworker. However, the man failed to register the vehicle for a year. By then, Chism had disappeared. The last confirmed sighting of him was on December 4, 1990. Television programs continued to cover the Chism story. In March 2021, Chism was played by Pittsburgh actor Nick Pascal in an episode of the reboot of America's Most Wanted. Given how long Chism has been missing, however, it is possible that he has died. It is also possible that he is still living the life of a fugitive under a false name, perhaps in another country and with his family. Most prisoners that try to escape get captured after being on the run only briefly. Most people go on vacation longer than prisoners manage to escape out of the hands of the authorities. Just ask Glen Chambers, if you can find him, that is, or if he's still alive. Chambers, who killed his girlfriend in Sarasota, has not been seen for 33 years after escaping, or 4 times longer than the average marriage lasts. Though Chambers' prison break in and of itself is impressive in a Netflix kind of way, the act that led him there in the first place is despicable. On January 22, 1975, Chambers assaulted 21-year-old Connie Weeks in the parking lot of Sarasota Lanes, a bowling alley where she worked as a server. Chambers went to jail. Weeks bailed him out. They went back to the Sarasota apartment they shared, where Chambers attacked her again. He carried her into Sarasota Memorial Hospital with severe brain trauma. Her blood was found in their apartment and in his car. She died 5 days later. Chambers was sentenced to death on July 11, 1975, and was being held in the Sarasota County Jail. 2 days later, he escaped down a rope made of bed sheets. 3 days after that, he was captured and eventually sent to Polk County Correctional Institution. For years, he was a model inmate and earned a job making furniture. On February 21, 1990, he placed himself in a wooden box that was loaded onto a truck to be delivered to Daytona Beach. Somewhere along Interstate 4, when traffic was at a crawl, he popped out of the box, opened the back door of the truck, and walked away. No one has seen him since. Chambers had a few things going for him. Back then, there was no digital fingerprint. It was much easier to obtain a fake ID and start a new life. Chambers also learned to speak Spanish in prison, and his IQ was on a Mensa level. Over the years, tips have come in from as far away as New Zealand, yet nothing concrete. Chambers would be 71 now. It is possible that he is still alive. He has not been arrested since the escape, as his fingerprints would have turned up in an ID system. Basically, he just vanished. Keep your eyes peeled. If he is still alive, he is living life as quietly as can be. Killers who escape prison and then go undetected for 3 decades generally don't kill again. Maybe he is among us. Remember that older gentleman you saw pushing carts at Publix the other day? How about the nice old-school crossing guard you waved to? Or the guy on the beach with the metal detector? Or the guy you nearly hit with that drive on 18? Any of them could be the person who killed Connie Weeks in Sarasota in 1975 and then jumped out of a furniture truck to become one of the most determined escapees in the history of American crime. After all, he did have a tattoo that said, "Live free or die." Killer and drug dealer Glen Stewart Godwin escaped from Folsom State Prison in 1987 and years later also managed to run away from a jail in Mexico. He is still on the run to this day. Godwin, who was on the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list for 20 years, managed to escape a California prison through a 1,000-foot drain pipe, and his escape had similarities with that of the protagonist of Shawshank Redemption. Glen Stewart Godwin ran away from Folsom State Prison, a maximum security prison located around 20 miles northeast of Sacramento, becoming one of the few prisoners who managed to escape in the jail's 124-year history. In 1980, at the age of 23, the criminal and his roommate, Frank Soto, who lived in Palm Springs, California, plotted to rob local drug dealer Kim Robert LaValle. Godwin and Soto lured LaValle back to their home, where Soto held him, while Godwin punched and kicked him, eventually stabbing the victim 26 times with a butcher knife. The two roommates then loaded the body onto a truck and set off to the desert, where Godwin tried to disguise the murder by using homemade explosives strapped to the body. But on August 3, 1980, some Eagle Mountain residents found a blown-up pickup truck with human remains inside, and, after police identified the body, Godwin was charged with first-degree murder. Following the killing, Godwin's roommate Koto, who described him as the most dangerous man I have ever met, testified against him, but in 1982 he was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. The following year, Godwin was sentenced for the murder and robbery to 26 years to life in prison. In 1987, the killer was transferred to Folsom State Prison in Represa, California, after attempting to escape Duell Vocational Institute, which is now closed, in San Joaquin County. But Godwin managed to run away from the maximum security prison on June 5, 1987, after cutting through security bars inside a walled prison yard and then escaping through a drain pipe that was 1,000 feet long. Authorities believe that either Godwin's wife or his accomplice, Lorenz Karlik, had left a raft that the criminal used to float down the river, where he ditched his prison clothes and followed painted arrows on rocks that directed him where to go. After the prisoners escaped, Karlik, who was also a former prison escapee, was arrested in Hesperia, California, and convicted for aiding Godwin's escape. Karlik hanged himself in the Los Angeles County Jail in 2002. The escapee's wife, Shelley Godwin, was classified as a federal fugitive in January 1988 for her role in her husband's escape. She was captured by the FBI in Dallas, Texas on February 7, 1990. Meanwhile, Godwin evaded authorities and escaped to Mexico, where he was involved in the drug trade, but was arrested in Puerto Vallarta and later convicted for drug trafficking in Guadalajara. While serving time at Jalisco State Penitentiary, he killed a fellow inmate who was part of a Mexican drug cartel. The new murder allegation delayed Godwin's extradition to the U.S., and this gave him time to plot another prison escape, which eventually happened in 1991. It is not clear how he escaped the Mexican jail, as authorities did not share detailed information with U.S. law enforcement. FBI Special Agent Dan Rodriguez said, "We didn't get any detailed account from the Mexican prison. What we have kind of speculated at this point was that he was able to make some cartel friends down there, so in exchange for committing a murder within the Mexican penitentiary, they would assist him with an escape out of that prison." In 1996, Godwin was added to the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list, and the following year he was reportedly seen in California, but managed to elude authorities. In 2016, he was removed from the 10 most wanted fugitives lists as he no longer fit criteria, the FBI's website says. A reward of up to $100,000 is offered for information leading to Godwin's arrest. American authorities think Godwin, who the FBI believes is fluent in Spanish, may be involved in the illicit drug trade somewhere in Latin America. Mr. Rodriguez said, "Any Spanish-speaking country would be ideal for him because he's a pretty charismatic guy and he always knew how to communicate and relate to people. But there is also speculation that he may be using some assumed name or alias and live in the U.S., with the FBI often receiving tips saying he may be in the country." Located on a lonely island in the middle of San Francisco Bay, Alcatraz, aka The Rock, had held captives since the Civil War. But it was in 1934 that Alcatraz was refortified into the world's most secure prison. Despite the odds, 36 men tried 14 separate escapes. Nearly all were caught or didn't survive the attempt. The fate of 3 particular inmates, however, remains a mystery to this day. Frank Morris arrived at Alcatraz in January 1960 after convictions for bank robbery, burglary, and other crimes and repeated attempts to escape various prisons. Later that year, a convict by the name of John Anglin was sent to Alcatraz, followed by his brother Clarence in early 1961. All three knew each other from previous stints in prison. Assigned to adjoining cells, they began hatching a plan to escape. Morris, known for his intelligence, took the lead in the planning. They were aided by another inmate, Alan West. On June 12, 1962, the routine early morning bed check turned out to be anything but. Three convicts were not in their cells: John Anglin, his brother Clarence, and Frank Morris. In their beds were cleverly built dummy heads made of plaster, flesh-tone paint, and real human hair that apparently fooled the night guards. The prison went into lockdown, and an intensive search began. As the days went by, the FBI, the Coast Guard, Bureau of Prison Authorities, and others began to find more evidence and piece together the ingenious escape plan. They were aided by inmate Alan West, who didn't make it out of his cell in time and began providing them with information. It turned out the group had begun laying plans the previous December. Using crude tools, the plotters each loosened the air vents at the back of their cells by painstakingly drilling closely spaced holes around the cover so the entire section of the wall could be removed. Once through, they hid the holes with whatever they could. Behind the cells was a common unguarded utility corridor. They made their way down this corridor and climbed to the roof of their cell block inside the building. More than 50 raincoats that they stole or gathered were turned into makeshift life preservers and a 6 by 14-foot rubber raft. They also built wooden paddles and converted a musical instrument into a tool to inflate the raft. The ceiling was a good 30 feet high, but using a network of pipes they climbed up and eventually pried open the ventilator at the top of the shaft. On the evening of June 11th, they were ready to go. West, though, did not have his ventilator grill completely removed and was left behind. The three others got into the corridor, gathered their gear, climbed up and out through the ventilator, and got onto the prison roof. Then they climbed over the fence and snuck to the northeast shore of the island and launched their raft. What happened next remains a mystery. Did they make it across the bay, get to Angel Island, and then cross Raccoon Strait into Marin County as planned? Or did the wind and waves get the better of them? Plenty of people have gone to great lengths to prove that the men could have survived, but the question remains, did they? The FBI officially closed its case on December 31, 1979, and turned over responsibility to the U.S. Marshals Service, which continues to investigate in the unlikely event that the trio is still alive. On April 6, 1968, Leonard Rayne Moses and others threw Molotov cocktails at a house during civil unrest in Pittsburgh that followed the assassination of the famous civil rights activist Martin Luther King Jr. Mary Amplo, who was inside the house at the time, was badly burned from the attack. She died a few months later from pneumonia while recovering from the burns. Moses was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole in 1970 for killing Amplo. He was 16 years old at the time of the conviction. In March 1971, Moses' case was brought before the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania to appeal his life sentence. His lawyers argued he was too young to make a voluntary waiver of his Miranda warnings. At the end of the court session, 2 justices provided dissenting opinions, concluding the case should be remanded for a new trial. Despite the court victory, Moses escaped custody on June 1, 1971, while attending his grandmother's funeral in Pittsburgh. He managed to escape despite being escorted by 2 police officers. After Moses escaped custody, he assumed the identity of Paul Dixon, which he has used since at least 1999. He used the alias while he was employed as a traveling pharmacist in Michigan, said Christman. In 2020, the FBI announced the arrest of Leonard Rayne Moses, nearly half a century after he escaped custody in 1971. Moses was arrested at his home in Grand Blanc, Michigan, on November 12th by the FBI's Detroit Fugitive Task Force. A native of Vienna, born October 2, 1889, Karl Minarik immigrated to New York in 1914, obtaining a job at the German Oddfellows home in Yonkers during July of that year. Using the name Frederick Mors, Minarik worked for 6 months at the home, arousing no suspicions as he went about his duties. Patients came and went throughout his tenure, several leaving in a hearse, but they were old and no one gave a second thought to their demise before the early days of February 1915. On the afternoon of February 2nd, Mors presented himself at the district attorney's office dressed in a corduroy hunting outfit, complete with knee pants and a feathered alpine cap. Approaching the desk sergeant, Menard confessed to the murders of 8 superannuated octogenarians, killed in order to make room for more inmates at the home. A phone call confirmed the 8 deaths, all listed as natural, and Menard was taken into custody. In jail, Menard's story underwent a sudden shift. The homicides had not been his idea, he now proclaimed, but rather had been ordered by officials at the home, who described the elderly victims as a lot of trouble and no good anyhow. On February 5th, the home superintendent and 3 more employees were clapped into jail as material witnesses, with the Oddfellows Lodge refusing to muster their bail. Although authorities refused to order exhumation of remains, investigation seemed to bear out Carl Menard's tale of inmates killed with chloroform and arsenic. Menard had warned patient Elizabeth Hauser of her impending death a day in advance, and a mortician recalled red markings similar to chloroform burns on the face of alleged victim Henry Horn. A teenage inmate of the home informed police about an errand she had run on January 4th, delivering a bottle of chloroform from employee Max Ring, jailed as a material witness, to Mors in the room occupied by patient Ferdinand Schultz. Schultz had died the same day, and other inmates suspected Mors of sabotaging the painter's scaffold that dropped Jacob Groh to his death on December 14th. The list went on, but prosecution was deferred in favor of a psychiatric test. Described as not well mentally, Menard was committed to Poughkeepsie's Hudson River State Hospital for the insane. His employer and co-workers were released, the case dismissed with a host of questions still unanswered. On May 10, 1916, a week before his scheduled deportation to Austria, Menard escaped from the hospital in Poughkeepsie and disappeared. He was never recaptured, but authorities took the loss in stride, announcing that the fugitive was not considered dangerous. He was never seen again, but a skeleton found in a patch of woods in Connecticut may have been his. Police found a bottle next to the skeleton that indicated suicide by poison. The world's most successful fugitive has been on the run for more than 60 years, despite repeated appeals to find him over the decades. John Patrick Hannan holds the record for the longest escape from custody after he used a knotted bedsheet to climb over the walls of the Verne prison in Portland, Dorset, in December 1955. He was 22 at the time of his great escape and has now notched up 6 decades at large. Although he is technically still a wanted man, Dorset police gave up searching for Hannan almost 20 years ago after the last high-profile appeal yielded no results. Hannan would now be aged 81 and is thought to be living back in his home country of Ireland. His time as a fugitive easily eclipses some of Britain's most notorious prisoners' efforts, such as the late train robber Ronnie Biggs, who spent 32 years on the run before giving himself up. The previous longest escape record in the world was 45 years and 11 months, held by Leonard Frisco from Nevada in the U.S., but was broken by Hannan in 2001. Hannan was jailed at the Old Bailey for 21 months for car theft and assaulting 2 police officers in 1995. But along with fellow inmate Gwyneth Thomas, he scaled the prison walls using knotted sheets to bust out. The pair broke into a nearby petrol station and helped themselves to overcoats, beer, and cigarettes before fleeing the island of Portland. Thomas, also aged 22 at the time, was arrested within 16 hours near Dorchester after the duo were spotted by a lorry driver. But Hannan evaded a major police manhunt, complete with a series of roadblocks and tracker dogs, to make his way to freedom. It is believed he made his way back to his native Ireland soon after his escape. In 1998, Dorset police appealed directly to Hannan to give himself up. In a forced newsletter, they stated, "If you read this, Mr. Hannan, please write in. We'd love to hear from you." A spokesman for Dorset police said they are currently no longer actively searching for Hannan, but would treat any information about his whereabouts with considerable interest. Joanne Chesimard, better known as Assata Shakur, remains a polarizing figure in American history. Born on July 16, 1947 in Queens, New York, Shakur became infamous for her involvement in the killing of a New Jersey state trooper during a 1973 shootout on the New Jersey Turnpike. To this day, the case of Assata Shakur continues to evoke strong emotions, sparking debates about her actions, the circumstances of the trial, and her subsequent escape to Cuba. On May 2, 1973, Assata Shakur, along with 2 fellow members of the Black Liberation Army, BLA, Sundiata Akoli and Zaid Malik Shakur, were traveling on the New Jersey Turnpike when they were pulled over by State Trooper Werner Forster and his partner, Trooper James Harper. What followed was a tragic and violent confrontation that resulted in Trooper Forster's death and the injury of both Assata Shakur and Trooper Harper. Assata Shakur's trial began in 1977, more than 4 years after the shootout on the New Jersey Turnpike. She faced charges including murder, attempted murder, and various other felonies related to the incident. Shakur maintained her innocence throughout the trial, insisting that she had not fired the fatal shot that killed Trooper Forster. The trial was highly contentious, marked by allegations of racial bias, inadequate legal representation, and questionable tactics by the prosecution. Despite these controversies, the jury found Shakur guilty of first-degree murder, assault, and several other charges in March 1977. She was sentenced to life in prison. Assata Shakur's case took a dramatic turn in November 1979 when she escaped from the Clinton Correctional Facility for Women in New Jersey. With the assistance of BLA members posing as visitors, she fled to Cuba, where she was granted political asylum by Fidel Castro's government. Her escape has further fueled debates about her guilt or innocence, as well as the legitimacy of her conviction. In Cuba, Assata Shakur continued to be an outspoken advocate for civil rights, social justice, and Black liberation. She published an autobiography titled Assata, an Autobiography, where she detailed her perspective on the events surrounding her conviction and escape. Her supporters argue that she was a victim of systemic racism and an unfair legal system, pointing to the numerous irregularities in her trial. The case of Assata Shakur has remained a contentious issue in U.S.-Cuba relations. The United States has repeatedly called for her extradition to face the outstanding charges against her. Cuba, however, has consistently refused to hand her over, citing political persecution and human rights concerns. On May 25, 1966, the court sentenced the death penalty to Lester Eubanks for the rape and murder of 14-year-old Melly Ellen Diener. In his first 7 years in prison, Eubanks became a model citizen, and the court granted him a holiday season furlough. The temporary release gave Eubanks time to shop at the Great Southern Shopping Center in Ohio on December 7, 1973. Afterward, he disappeared into the night. The Ohio Department of Corrections listed Eubanks as a fugitive. However, federal authorities only started looking for Eubanks in the 1990s. The search gained traction in 2016 when the U.S. Marshals Service picked up the case and suspected Eubanks to be living under the alias of Victor Young, who seemed to have resided and worked numerous jobs in Los Angeles from 1975 to 1996. Several promising leads about Eubanks' whereabouts appeared through the years. Still, authorities never caught Eubanks. He has since been added to the U.S. Marshals list of the 15 most wanted fugitives in the country. Eubanks has been on the lam longer than any other criminal on the list of most wanted fugitives. He is also the oldest criminal currently on the list. The Marshal's Office offered a $50,000 reward for information that leads to the capture and arrest of Eubanks. An 80-year-old career criminal who has been on the run for nearly 44 years is now a free man after the Department of Corrections decided he was simply too old to keep looking for. Jerry Bergevin was once one of Michigan's most wanted criminals before he was imprisoned in 1962 and became one of the most sought-after men in the United States when he escaped from Camp Waterloo in April 1969 and dropped off the face of the earth. Numerous sightings and leads never turned up a trace of Bergevin, and now, with no idea whether he is dead or alive, the Michigan Department of Corrections has officially called off the search, leaving the granddaughter who has searched for any trace of him heartbroken. His legend preceded him across the state, where he was regarded as a cocky troublemaker who would accelerate his car away even as a police officer leaned into the driver's window to turn off the ignition, leaving him dangling from his vehicle. He was also proficient along with his wife at cracking safes, leading his granddaughter Angela Mitchells to say, "My grandma and grandpa were pretty much the Bonnie and Clyde in the 1950s. They were pretty poor. They had 3 daughters and stole a lot from farmers markets to feed their 3 kids." His brushes with the law began when he was barely out of his teens, and in 1962 he was arrested for breaking into a Flint, Michigan drugstore, pleaded guilty, and was sentenced to 15 years behind bars. However, Bergevin wrote letters begging to be transferred from the state prison in Jackson to Camp Waterloo so he could become involved in a dental technician training program. The 37-year-old Bergevin never started the dental class. One day, they did a formal count and discovered he was missing, said Lieutenant Charles Levins, who runs the outstate region of the MDOC's Absconder Recovery Unit. Rushing into action to apprehend the hardened criminal, the state offered a $25 reward for information that led to Bergevin's arrest. The mystery behind his disappearance deepened, with some relatives believing that Bergevin died in a motorcycle accident as he fled to California, while others said that he was killed by a murderous farmer as he sought work in the 1970s at a Californian farm. One short, undated, unsigned, handwritten note in Bergevin's file said that he was last known to be working under the name of Mark Thomas at a hospital in New Orleans. The incomplete trail inspired Mitchells to begin a quest to find the truth after the Bay City Times printed the story about Bergevin's encounter with the police officer who pulled him over. She tenaciously visited libraries and pored over old newspaper clippings, and at a courthouse in Ohio, she found a 1976 will from her grandfather's mother that had all three of her sons as beneficiaries. Mitchell's mother, Cindy Schumacher, said that her mother was angry with Bergevin for not bringing his accomplices into the picture and getting a plea deal with the authorities. She became so angry that she eventually married another man who forbade the girls from talking about their father or keeping pictures of him. During her search, there were moments when Mitchells thought that she had hit upon a lead. Her heart skipped a beat last year when she saw "Captured" appeared next to her grandfather's name on the MDOC's most wanted escapees and parole absconders. However, it was an administrative error, simply reflecting the end of his status as a wanted man. In 2009, the MDOC got a tip that Bergevin was living under an alias in Detroit. But an investigator who followed up found that the house had burned to the ground 2 weeks before and had been abandoned for many years before that. Officials with the MDOC said that Bergevin is the only person in the last year to receive an administrative discharge, which a prison escapee can be considered for once he or she turns 80 and has not been heard from for at least 5 years. For Mitchells, the news that no state or federal employee will continue to search for her is bittersweet after years of trying to piece together his disappearance. "He's home free, I guess," she said. She said she believes her grandfather probably died years ago. He spent decades dodging the law. He's escaped from jail twice by helicopter. He's given millions to the poor. This is the story of how Greece's most wanted man became a folk hero. Vassilis Paleokostas' criminal career began with modest robberies in the 1980s, before escalating to high-profile bank heists and kidnappings. Unlike other notorious bandits, Paleokostas claims no one was harmed during his crimes. Born in 1966 in central Greece, he grew up in a region where banditry wasn't always condemned. His criminal activities began to gain significant attention when, during a severe economic crisis in Greece, he stole substantial amounts from banks, symbolically targeting institutions blamed for the country's financial woes. His reputation was further cemented by elaborate escapes, including one where he used a helicopter piloted under duress. Paleokostas' most famous escapes include fleeing Chalkida jail using bedsheets in 1991 and twice escaping from maximum security prisons via helicopter in 2006 and 2009, with assistance from his brother Nikos and accomplices. These dramatic jailbreaks, coupled with his Robin Hood-like redistribution of stolen wealth, earned him folk hero status among some Greeks. Despite a massive manhunt and a substantial bounty on his head, Paleokostas has remained elusive, with rumors of his whereabouts and activities continuing to circulate. His life story, marked by brazen robberies, kidnappings for ransom, and audacious prison escapes, reflects a deep-seated defiance against the authorities and a complex relationship with the public, some of whom view him as a symbol of resistance against corruption and inequality. Convicted of murder in 1962, George Wright hijacked a flight out of Miami. Then he disappeared until 2011. Now we can tell the complete story. On August 22, 1970, George Edward Wright broke out from a New Jersey prison for the first time. To avoid getting captured and imprisoned, he devised a plan to hijack an airplane. On July 31, 1972, Wright and his accomplices hijacked a Delta Airlines flight flying from Detroit, Michigan to Miami, Florida. George Wright, dressed as a reverend and armed with a handgun, took a flight attendant hostage and demanded to speak to the pilot. The other members of his makeshift band of hijackers in their respective disguises followed suit. They ordered the plane to land in Miami as scheduled, but if the 86 passengers on board were to be safe, their demands needed to be met. The hijackers wanted $1 million, delivered by a man in a skin-tight bathing suit to ensure nobody armed could approach the plane. The pilot radioed the situation to the control tower, and the FBI was quickly on the case. Once they landed, an FBI agent in tight swimwear approached the plane with the cash in a suitcase. A crew member was instructed to hoist the cash into the plane. True to his word, Wright released the passengers and informed the pilot and crew they would be staying on board and flying him and his cohorts to Algeria. The pilot informed Wright they did not have enough fuel for an international flight, and he was not trained or experienced in anything but domestic flights. In an attempt to avoid any loss of life, the airline and the FBI arranged for the plane to land in Boston, refuel, and have an international navigator join the crew. They then set out for Algeria. With the help of Spanish air traffic control, they landed in Algiers. Thanks to a sympathetic socialist government, Wright and his crew were able to gain political asylum with the help of Black Panther's leader and American expatriate Eldridge Cleaver, who had been granted asylum after fleeing assault charges in the U.S. The $1 million, however, was seized by the Algerian government, and it, the plane, and the flight crew were sent back to the U.S. Wright and the others lived with Cleaver for a time, but traveled to Paris after becoming disheartened with Cleaver's cause. In 1976, while living in Paris, George Brown, Joyce Brown, the McNairs, and the children were all apprehended when it was discovered they were carrying false passports. Their identities were uncovered, and they were tried in a French court for the plane hijacking. This was due to their attorneys arguing they would not receive a fair trial in the U.S. Each adult was sentenced to 3 years in prison. Once again, however, George Wright evaded capture. Just prior to the arrest of the others, Wright broke away from the rest of the group and decided he was better off making a life for himself on his own. While the rest were in prison, Wright traveled to Portugal in order to avoid being found out like his fellow former Americans. Wright began using the name George as a cover and eventually met a woman named Rosario, who he took quite an interest in. Unfortunately for their budding romance, Wright didn't feel safe staying in Portugal and wanted the same asylum he received in Algeria. Wright moved to the nation of Guinea-Bissau in Africa, as their government was known to offer refuge to expatriates. There, the government granted him asylum and citizenship. The vice president of Guinea-Bissau believed Wright was a revolutionary thanks to his actions in the U.S. and offered to help establish Wright's false identity of José Luis George dos Santos. Now, with proper paperwork in hand, Wright didn't feel the need to run any longer. Rosario moved to Guinea-Bissau, and eventually the couple married and had 2 children. Wright held various jobs there before moving his family back to Portugal, where he became a citizen. Wright lived there in peace with his new family from 1993 until September 2011. The FBI reopened Wright's case in a renewed push to capture wanted fugitives. A look at Wright's sister's phone records showed she made occasional calls to a man in Portugal. Wright's Portuguese ID card was obtained, and the fingerprints associated with it were matched to his fingerprints on file with the New Jersey Department of Corrections. An international arrest warrant was obtained. When he was confronted with his real name, José Luis George dos Santos admitted his true identity. The next hurdle was extradition. The U.S. government intended to have Wright brought back to the country he fled in order to serve the remaining 22 years of his prison sentence for the robbery and murder of Walter Patterson, as well as stand trial for the plane hijacking. These plans hit a snag, however, when Wright's Portuguese attorney argued that the statute of limitations for his crimes had run out, because despite the crimes occurring in the U.S., Portugal has a 30-year statute of limitations for murder. A panel of judges were tasked with determining if George Wright would be returned to the U.S., where, given his age, he would almost certainly die in prison. After weeks of deliberation, the judges decided Wright could no longer pose a threat to anyone, and he had been a Portuguese citizen for almost 20 years. Given these facts, he would not be extradited back to the U.S. This decision was later upheld despite appeals from the U.S. government. After robbery, murder, airplane hijacking, and plenty of other felonies stemming from the hijacking, and 41 years on the run, George Wright was free to live his life without punishment. That is, as long as he never leaves Portugal. It was in February 1716 that Countess Winifred Maxwell, wife of William, 5th Earl of Nithsdale of Traquair House, engineered her husband's escape from the Tower of London on the eve of his planned execution. The couple met at the French court at the end of the 17th century, where he had gone to pledge loyalty to exiled James VII, and she was visiting her father, the Earl of Powys, a staunch supporter of the Jacobite cause, who was also in exile after being falsely named in the Popish plot conspiracy and accused of planning to kill Charles II. As a result, Winifred's father was also held in the Tower of London, with her mother then embroiled in a plot to secure his release. First, she tried to lobby King William of Orange directly, without success, with a more rudimentary approach than found. A black cloak and some pots of makeup were then deployed to help hustle her bearded husband out of the tower disguised as a woman. William Maxwell was captured and imprisoned following the 1715 Battle of Preston, with his titles and land forfeited. In December 1715, with the financial support of her brother-in-law, Winifred headed to London via Newcastle and York with her servant Cecilia Evans in a bid to lobby for her husband's release. In deep snow, the pair ventured south, with Winifred getting the last place on the stagecoach at York and Evans riding behind. The journey was halted after 60 miles given the weather, but the pair battled on to the capital with the aid of 2 new horses. In the capital, there was important business to do. Winifred lobbied hard for her husband's release, even meeting King George I in person to plead William's case. Despite winning popular sympathy, Winifred's diplomacy failed, so she turned to more daring, dramatic measures, an account by Historic Environment Scotland said. Then, 2 days before the date set for William's execution, she returned to the tower and pretended her petition for his release had been approved by the king. She even gave his guards a few coins so they could drink to the king and William's health. The next day, she returned to the tower for her last visit before his planned execution. Winifred's friend wore an extra petticoat and cloak, left them behind, and exited the lodgings, pretending to cry with a hanky held over her face. After several comings and goings of Winifred's friends, who acted desperate to see their friend in his final hours, and the wards duly confused, William was dressed in the women's clothes, padded with makeup, and ushered away from his cell holding arms with one of the women. Winifred remained in the cell, pretending to talk to her husband as if he was still there and mimicking his voice for the benefit of the guards. In time, she left the cell and told the servant lighting the candles that her husband was saying his prayers and did not want to be disturbed. She hurried away from the tower with the waiting Lord Nithsdale fleeing to France as his wife headed to Scotland to collect their young daughter and family papers. The king was furious. In a letter to her sister following the escape, Winifred declared, "I had done George I more mischief than any woman in Christendom." Only one other escape in 1722 was ever attempted from the tower after this episode, and the prisoner was recaptured and executed. The two lived in relative peace in France, with Winifred dying in Rome in 1749, 5 years after the death of her husband.